You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
Shockwave Skull Session podcast. This is the Dokken episode. And you're not listening to the Classic Metal Show. This is the Shockwave Skull Sessions. We are doing an episode on Dokken because our good friend, Mr. James Curl, just released a brand new, I guess we could call it brand new, just came out about a week or two ago, Dokken, Into the Fire, and Other Embers of 80s Metal History.
That's right. Yeah, it came out about 3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago, man.
Brand new.
Very, very cool. And who else better to get on a Dokken podcast than our one and only Wendell Neeley from the Classic Metal Show. In fact, if we didn't have Wendell on the show, it would Wendell. Look at it. Now I'm calling you Wendell, like I'm Don Dokken or Ron Keel or one of your other good friends calling you Wendell. Mr. Neeley. It would be blasphemous not to have Neeley on a podcast regarding Dokken. Am I correct there, Mr. Neeley?
You're right. You know when people get to be familiar with you when they start calling you by your first name.
That is correct. And I'm not to that status yet, so I do apologize. Wendell,
I don't know, Bob. You and I have hung out on many occasions, and I've made the trip to L.A., and we've done several NAMM shows together and some Inside Metal screenings, and just good times had by all, having dinners together and late night breakfast with the swishy waiters and all kinds of stuff. So
absolutely,
I think you've earned the right to call me by my first name.
Well, I am honored. Speaking of breakfast, we had a couple breakfasts, or at least one with James Curl down at the NAMM show as well.
We did. The Heavy Metal Hall of Fame. Remember that?
That's right. That was awesome. So
that one as well.
Absolutely. And our third guest, who I have yet to meet yet, but dying to meet, the one and only Miss Kendall Peters. What is going on, Kendall?
Doing good. Still unemployed in the quarantine, making the most of my time. It's a pleasure to be on Shockwave Skull Sessions. And yes, I have to make it to Los Angeles. My family gives me shit because I want to go there just simply to maybe go to the Rainbow Bar and Grill. But to me, that's where the scene I love is from. And hope to get there one day.
Well, let's see if the Rainbow Bar and Grill will last after this whole quarantine and all the bullshit going on. Hopefully, it won't affect the Rainbow and various other rock clubs in LA, but you never know. And Kendall, you still you are still doing the radio show, correct? Why don't you talk a little bit about the show you got?
Yes, so I'm on uncontrollednoise.com with the great Shockwaves and Classic Metal Show. It's Metal and Kendle. It airs Wednesday nights, 9 to 11 p.m. Eastern, and it's just a solo show where I play music, talk whatever I'm feeling, and that's the Kendle part, and the metal part is the classic metal bands I love, particularly Dokken.
Right. And I do love your show. I've tuned in several times, and it's great. Not only Dokken, but you'll play a wide array from, bands like Metal Church and Armored Saint to, from the thrash to the glam to, a lot of 80s and some 90s metal. So great mix. And being as young as you are, I think that's awesome, man, that you're really promoting the classic 80s, 90s, and not just the popular songs. You'll play a lot of the underground songs, which is awesome.
Yeah, I guess I mostly like the underground stuff, or the deep cuts, as some would call it. But right. I just like, in general, good music, and that's why I gravitated toward all those bands.
Yes, and being as young as you are, you're this is a college. Is this through college you're doing this as well? Because you had a college radio station too, correct?
Yeah, I got my start through college radio. We had a Metal Mondays at Wilkes University where I went, but I loved it so much that I was given the opportunity by Corey from Uncontrolled Noise to start a show. And originally it was a podcast, but now it's back to the live version where I get to talk to a lot of people from like the Classic Metal Show fans and friends. So I continue to do that.
Just to give you a friendly warning, though, Kendall, once you do graduate from college, you might be ignored by Neeley.
Well,
he likes young school students. So, I just let you know, but, I will never ignore you, Kendall. Am I right in saying this, James?
Yeah, I think so. I've heard that Wendell liked the younger girls.
Well, I graduated 2 years ago.
Oh.
Still talking to Neeley, but that's why I went an extra year.
Sorry, Neeley, got to bust your balls somehow, right?
That's all right, Bob. I got broad shoulders. I can handle it.
I just hope I didn't hurt your feelings there. But anyway, let's get into this book, man. A lot of great stories. In fact, one story that you neglected to mention, in fact, I don't even know if you're familiar with this, James. It's actually regarding Neeley. Are you familiar that Neeley taught Don Dokken how to bowl?
I was actually quite familiar with that, but it was kind of embarrassing, so I didn't put it in the book.
Well, it's an exclusive here on the Shockwave Skull Sessions. Neeley teaches Don Dokken how to bowl.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So if you guys don't get the inside joke, well, pity for you. Anyway, let's talk about this Dokken book. You know, the one thing I'm really impressed about, and to be honest, dude, I haven't had a chance to read it. I've just briefly gone through it. And I like the fact, anyone, could have got the George Lynches and the main guys, obviously, in Dokken.
Sure.
But you really dug deep, and you got a lot of, you got Greg Leon, who was involved in the very early years as a guitar player. With Don on the very first recordings with Don, as well as Gary Holland, a fantastic drummer. Many of them remember him from Great White, and you really get into the early days, which a lot of people don't discuss. Did you also talk to Michael White? I see he's in the acknowledgments.
I did talk to Michael White. He played
The
with
White.
George Lynch and Mick Brown when they were in the Boys.
That's correct. He was a singer
70s.
for, you know what? The White was the first, the second live band, local band I saw when I was 16 years old. The first being a la carte at the Golden Bear. And then I saw Michael White. He was in the Greatest Zeppelin tribute band. And this was back in 1981, probably. And he had a Zeppelin tribute band called The White. And they did a fantastic, and this is before the whole tribute band things. You had Randy Hansen doing the Hendrix, and you had The White, and they would do a 2-hour Zeppelin set, and they would do like Achilles' Last Stand and Kashmir and just all this cool shit. And they were awesome. They actually did a record on Atlantic, I believe. He did a solo record, and supposedly Zeppelin had it squashed. Did he get into that at all, by chance?
He didn't mention anything about that, but he did mention that he met Robert Plant, and they more or less became friends, and Robert Plant didn't have a problem with what he was doing at all.
Oh, okay, that's good. I heard, through rumors, because that album was not promoted at all, and I heard that Zeppelin was still, this was, I guess, shortly after Bonham had died.
Mm-hmm.
Probably a couple years after, but of course he had the whole Zeppelin catalog going. And supposedly Zeppelin, I don't know if it was Jimmy Page or Plant or whatever, did not want Atlantic Records to promote The White, and supposedly had that record squashed. Now that's the rumors I heard from many people, but who knows? Who knows the real?
Yeah, he didn't mention anything about that. One guy that I did get for the book that goes back really far was Stephen R. Barry. He was in the very first incarnation of Dokken when it was just a 3-piece band back in 1976, right after Don quit or changed the name from Airborne to Dokken. So I did get to talk to Stephen R. Barry, the bass player, and wow. Don played guitar and Greg Peckett played drums. And I talked to him, and he told me some great information too.
Oh, wow. Great. And didn't Juan Croucier's brother play with Dokken too for a little while?
Yeah, they both did. Juan Croucier and Juan Croucier's brother did.
Wow.
Over in Germany. Yeah.
Yes, I do remember that. 80s. Well, I'll tell you a little story before we get started. First time I saw Dokken, I believe, was at the Country Club, and I was a huge a fan of Malice. I think it was prior to them putting out their debut in the beginning, but they had a demo tape that Michael Wagner produced. Again, a big connection there with the Dokken camp. But they did a show, I believe, at the Country Club. It was Lita Ford, Malice, and Dokken opened, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember who was in Dokken at the time, but I believe it was their first LA show. And I just knew of Dokken from Germany because I was a big fan of European, the new wave of British heavy metal European bands. And I remember seeing the Dokken as an import. So I always thought he was this German dude that came over. I wish I remember. I remember seeing the show, but I can't recall who was in that first touring band. If it was George, this would be prior to George Lynch, correct?
That would be prior to George Lynch, yeah. And a lot of people did think that Dokken was a German band from the very beginning because Breaking the Chains had come out with under a French label.
Correct. Carrere, which was Saxon's label, I remember.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. Kendall, why don't you talk about your early Dokken experience? I know obviously you're a lot younger, but what got you into Dokken and becoming such a huge fan of that style of LA metal, especially being from the Midwest?
Well, it started with just the style of that heavy metal, hard rock, and because I liked that, I had watched the Hearing Aid video, which was the first time that I saw Dokken. Very, vaguely had I remembered hearing some of their songs in the past, but then when I saw specifically Don in the video singing his part, I just thought he was more unique than most singers, although everyone back then had their uniqueness, but he just had something special. So that caused me just to grab my attention on the band, but then I took it further to become the huge fan that I am in terms of just watching their videos. I started with the early albums from the 80s, their first 4 classics, and then gradually became more leaning in my favorites to their later albums just because I relate more to the lyrics. And as John Levin would say in the book, by the way, that Dokken's music later on was more like Cheerios with salsa, and I liked the salsa, so I became more of a hardcore fan in that sense of liking their entire discography. And also, I was picking up the guitar around the same time, and even though I'm in the Don camp, I feel that, I know George Lynch is my favorite player, so that grew my bond with Dokken even more in terms of enjoying his guitar playing and his special characteristics in the band. Overall, just, that's it. And just they've become just my favorite band through all that for 10 years now.
Right on.
It's been about 10 years. Sophomore year is when I really got into metal. It was not just Dokken at that time. It was all the other bands you had mentioned that I like in the past, like more the B, C level bands. In my ears, not B and C level. They're better than the A's, but I just became a metalhead in that sense around that time.
All right. Just curious, was your mom into metal or into a lot of these bands and turned you on to it?
Definitely not my mom. She would cite her favorite band as Smash Mouth, but not be able to name even their hit song.
Is your mom younger than you are?
No, but she's a bit ditzier.
Just do us a favor. Don't take her to a Dokken concert or she's liable to get punched out by Don.
Well, she could have actually, because the first Dokken concert I went to was in 2015, and that's the only one my parents went with me. And I had drawn a picture of the band in their current lineup because I feel there wasn't really much of those. Like, people don't appreciate the current lineups as much. So I drew them a picture, and she kept showing the picture to Don, and I could tell by the 5th time she showed it to Don, he got annoyed. Like, okay, we get it. There was a picture. Get the fuck out of here. So he could have, and she did rush the stage after the show to get him to sign it, which he did, which he's cool for that. But she was safe from the fists.
So people that don't know, apparently Don has a penchant for punching out mothers. Which isn't that right, Neeley?
Well, as the story goes, about 4 years ago, I was with Dokken in at a club or a venue in Dayton, Ohio. And for some reason, which I don't even understand to this day, Don swore on stage because the sound man was doing such a bad job and there was so much feedback. I mean, you could, the video is still out there on YouTube of the live performance in Dayton, Ohio. And every time Don went to the mic to sing, the monitors would just feed back just horrifically. I was on stage, and believe me, it just would knock you back across the stage wall. That the feedback was so bad. So Don just got so disgusted with it when it fed back, he just went, fuck. And for some reason, people found that offensive. I don't know. I don't get it. They thought it was horrific. I don't know if it was a Bible Belt town or something like that, but people were all upset that Don swore on stage. And then after the show was over, not a whole lot happened. I mean, I went to the promoter or the club owner. I collected Don's settlement. and Don signed some autographs, and we got on the van and went back to the hotel. That was all there was to it. And before you knew it, online on these bulletin boards and social media, people were claiming that Dokken was rude and Don punched some kid's mother. She just went up to get an autograph from him, and he slapped her. She went up and had like Back for the Attack album in her hand, and he slapped it out of her hand and punched her. And all, it's like, when in the fuck did this happen? So that was always a big running joke here on the Classic Metal Show, but for people to fabricate a story like that, it's like, yeah, Don punched my mother in the face and knocked her album out of her hand.
Well, dude, that's classic. I think you should go for it. That's great publicity, dude. As a publicist, think about it. That'll bring the rebellion back to metal.
Of course.
Left hook from right field, right? As Armored Saint would say.
Right. Nobody wants to hear about Don punching out their mother.
I don't know, man. You remember the big controversy that Axl Rose and Vince Neil had when Vince Neil said he wanted to punch out Axl, and it got all over the music news? Maybe we could...
That's one thing, musician on musician. That's one thing, a little rivalry there. But to punch out a kid's mother, I don't think that's going to fly too well with most people, especially in this ultra-sensitive age.
Well, what if it's a mother trucker? What if it happens to be Sebastian Bach?
If Sebastian Bach was in the building, it might be fine.
Well, let's get into this. To begin, James, talk about how this whole thing started and the process. I know you did a fantastic book on Ronnie James Dio, we got to mention, which came out that's about a little over a year ago now, right? Almost 2 years ago.
Right about 2 years ago.
Yeah.
I finished that book up, and I decided to do another book, and I just started thinking about different bands to write about, and Dokken popped into my mind because they've always been one of my favorite bands ever since I was 15 years old. And I had befriended Neeley, so I reached out to Neeley and asked him if he could maybe hook me up with Don for some interviews. And I had already known Jeff because Jeff did the forward on my Dokken book, and I mentioned it to Jeff.
Even on the Dio book,
the forward
right?
on the Dio book,
right?
And I mentioned a book about Dokken to Jeff, and he thought that was a good idea. So Jeff and Don both agreed to do interviews, multiple interviews, and I reached out to the other guys, and they wanted to write their own books. Particularly Mick, he said, well, he wanted to write his own book, so he didn't want to tell me all of his secrets. So I just went ahead and moved forward with Don and Jeff and anybody else I could get in touch with, and wrote the book that way. And I asked Neeley to write the book for it. I thought that was appropriate since he was a good friend of Don and he had been a fan of Dokken for 30 years. So it turned into a life of its own with people I got in touch with, and with Wendell's help, which I owe a lot to him for helping me out with that. It probably wouldn't have happened without his help. So thank you, Neeley.
Go ahead, kiss his ass.
I am.
Well, in one sentence, I'm Wendell, and the other sentence, I'm Neeley.
Yeah, Wendell and Neeley.
Still, he's not quite at that level where he could call you Wendell full time. He's got to just kind of sneak it in there every once in a while.
Sure.
Cool, man. Yeah, fantastic book. And the Dio book was a very awesome book, and you really touched on a lot of stuff that even I didn't know about Dio. And Dio was my very first interview I did when I was started the Headbanger, and when he just put out the 1983 debut album. He invited me over to his house. I was 16. No, I was 17 years old. I hung out at his house, his old house in Tarzana on Donna Lane for like 2 hours. And it was just one of the greatest experiences. And, so great to see that you put there's not really a lot published about Ronnie James Dio really and his personal stuff. And same with Dokken. And a lot of people don't realize the history of Dokken. So many people think, it's just this the band that came out in the early to mid 80s, and they're just like the stock 80s hair metal band. But you really get into the history, which I appreciate. And as you guys know, I did the Inside Metal series, and the first title of that series, The Pioneers of LA Hard Rock and Metal. I get really deep into the beginnings of the LA scene from the late 70s, the Van Halen era and the Starwood, to the beginning of, Don's career with, as you mentioned, his band Airborne. And of course, George Lynch had the Boys and Exciter before that. And, Autograph were called Wolfgang. And of course, Quiet Riot with Randy Rhoads. Yesterday and today we're playing, the LA clubs as well as playing the Bay Area since, the mid to late 70s. And a lot of people don't know that history, and you really get into it, which I appreciate in interviewing a lot of the people from the early Dokken days in this book. Talk a little bit about that, because obviously I was too young to hit the Starwood and all those clubs, and but me growing up in LA, I remember that whole scene, and I really remember the Hollywood scene, and there were the bands that we called the Redondo Beach scene, which was pretty much Dokken, Great White, who were Dante Fox at the time, who I used to see all the time at the Woodstock Club, and that was back even before Gary Holland, when Tony Richards from Wasp was playing drums, and of course Don Costa on bass. But Dante Fox, Malice, Total Access Studio was kind of the hub. Win Davis's place, and Michael Wagner just came over, started working there, and that was kind of the Redondo Beach scene. And Motley Crue had a bit of, because I know Mick Mars was from there, and it was there was a scene there. You had the Strand and clubs before that. I can't remember the names, but talk a little bit about that whole era.
That was a fun era, and I think it's important for people to realize that Dokken is an important band because they go so far back in that era, and they're a piece of that history that happened. They're a piece of it. Dawn and all those guys, they are a piece of what developed. It's just amazing to listen to these guys talk when I do interviews with them and hear them tell their stories about playing at all of these famous clubs. The Whiskey A Go-Go and Gazzari's and the Troubadour, and opening up for bands like Van Halen before they were even famous, and opening up for bands like Motley Crue. I think it is important for people to understand that these bands are important in the history of rock and roll. A lot of them just get labeled as hair metal bands or glam bands, and they're just tossed into the whole mix like they're not important. But, they really are in the whole scheme of things.
There were the latter bands, the Poisons and the Warrants, and a lot of these guys that came over from out of state, that came over and made themselves a name in LA in the mid 80s. And, they worked their ass off and played the clubs a bit. But, that was already when MTV was in high gear. And
Sure.
when all these bands were playing after Van Halen got signed, which, was, I guess, 78, they might have even got signed in 77, I don't know, with Warner. But right after that is when New Wave and punk hit. So they were not signing bands until really around the time 82, 80, 83. And really, the US Festival was a big thing. Of course, on MTV was all New Wave in the early 80s. And then they see that the US Festival Metal Day, they had all these huge artists on the other days, from The Clash to David Bowie to, Aha, to all the biggest MTV bands. And then the Metal Day gets 3 times as many audience there. And then at that point on, MTV became the metal video station. That's when they really incorporated a lot more metal videos, obviously. And that's when you saw the second wave of bands really hit. But, the first wave, as you mentioned, Motley Crue, of course, Nikki Sixx was in London. Mick was in several different bands. Tommy Lee and Greg Leon were in Sweet 19, and they were involved with Joey Vera from Armored Saint. So all these early bands, Wasp, were Sister back then. Everyone thinks that they just came out of LA, boom, and they got big. But most of these bands were playing since the late 70s. Busting their ass in the clubs, Dokken included when he was in Airborne, George Lynch included when he was in, the Boys and Exciter. They were playing alongside the Van Halens and all that, and a lot of people don't realize that. So it is great that you expose that, James.
Yeah, and another thing, these guys really paid their dues. They came from nothing. They ate hot dogs and top ramen, and they had no money, and Don was buying and selling used cars to scratch together enough money to pay his rent, him and Michael Wagner. George Lynch at one point was living in the back of his car, playing clubs. These guys really paid their dues, and they came from nothing, and they were broke, and they all busted their ass to get where they're at today.
Yeah, thank God for Gallo wine, right?
That's right.
Neeley, going back, how did you get? For people that don't know, Neeley and Don you're kind of like Don's new road manager, so to speak. How did you guys?
I don't know that I'm his new road manager, but James gave me the opportunity to write the foreword to the new book, and I'm not a writer. I certainly don't believe I have those chops, but I had to sit there and think about it and relate my experience knowing Don as a person as well as a musician. I was a fan. If you read the forward in the new book, which basically you could read the whole forward on Amazon if you don't own the book already. But my relationship with Don went back to 1995. I met Don actually 25 years ago this past month. I met him in person on May 6th at a club in Toledo, Ohio called Roxanne's. Dokken had gotten back together for the Dysfunctional tour. It was just by chance that I got to meet Don face to face, and just the discussion I had with him because I was already slated to go to broadcasting school because I was determined to be a broadcaster. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I was going to get into radio. That was something I had in the back of my mind for years, and I already decided I was going to go. Dokken had gotten back together. I was just thrilled about that. I went to the show. I just happened to meet Don. I told him what my plans were, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I was going to do. And he basically told me, hey, I want you to keep in touch with me and let me know how that goes. Keep me up to date. And I did. And from there, we just developed a lifelong friendship to where now I travel with Dokken periodically. In fact, this past March, Dokken was going to go out on this tour before this pandemic hit. And I was basically his personal assistant, as you put it, his new road manager. Because of his surgery in November, he was a little bit hamstrung, not being able to have the dexterity in his hands that he normally would. And I had to help him. I had to help the guy with his day-to-day functions and, wardrobe and getting him on stage and taking care of him more or less. But, it was something that as a friend, I said, hey, I'll do what I have to do to see that you guys are successful. And that not only goes for Don, but that goes for John and Chris and BJ. We had a really good time. We had a 3-day run back in the first week of March. We went to Midland, Texas, El Paso, Texas, and Biloxi, Mississippi, and traveling for 4 days as a band of brothers, as it were. It was a really good time, and the guys in the band, they told me, you know what, this is the smoothest 4 days having you on the road with us, because you got Don to do what he needed to do on time, because Don is notoriously late, and it's just kind of an inside joke, but they call it Dokken time. No, we're not on time. We're on Dokken time. So anyway, things went well, and Don has been very gracious to me and been an inspiration to me, and allowing me to, I wouldn't say allow me to, but has inspired me to start the Classic Metal Show 25 years ago. And he's been a good friend, and he's come on the show many, many times. I get so many emails and messages from people. I just love when Don comes on because he's so open and honest and tells great stories, and he's just relaxed, and you can tell that he trusts you guys, and he'll tell us stuff. He obviously will tell stories and reveal things to you guys that he would never tell anybody just on a regular interview. And I think James kind of got to know that a little bit in talking with Don as often as he did in writing this book.
Absolutely, and it is a great forward. I did have a chance to read that. And how is Don doing now? I know it sucks that he was only able to do 3 shows, and then the pandemic hit. But is he recuperated pretty well then from the surgery?
Yeah, he's coming along. I mean, his right hand is the most affected. His left hand, he's doing pretty well with that. His right hand still's got a little bit of time to go. But I think with this pandemic hitting, as much as I enjoy being on the road, and as much as I enjoy seeing Dokken live, and the fact that they hooked up with George Lynch and Lynch Mob on this this twin bill, it was going to be something very cool. But this has also allowed Don to take the time to put together this CD that comes out in August, the Lost Tracks, the very early stuff Dokken, and it's also allowed him the time to actually sit down and concentrate on the brand new material, which will be a new Dokken record through Silver Linings Records, hopefully before the end of the year.
All right. Now, this retrospect, is this going to include like early Airborne songs, or is it all unreleased stuff, or from demo tapes, or?
It's demo tapes, it's unreleased songs, it's stuff that I think may have been on the Carrera release, but it's all remastered. It's brought up to the current day technology. And plus, it's got 3 bonus tracks, which one of the bonus tracks was actually released this week with a pretty cool video with some old photos, a montage of photos, and the one and only Kendall Peters. She was very influential in helping to pick that lead-off track.
Tell us about that, Kendall.
Well, as we know, Neeley has all the sweet hookups. So what he did was
just like Napoleon Dynamite, right?
Yes, just like Pedro's cousin.
Exactly.
So he trusted in me to send me the 3 singles and ask my opinions on them, in which I thought would make a good video. And not to give anything away, but 2 of them were upbeat rockers, and they were going to make a great video. I think in terms of this video they just released for Step Into the Light, the feel of the song really matched that mood of going back to those older photos. So I could say Dokken fans will like very much the 3 singles.
I know you obviously got to know Dom through Neeley, but, being a big Dokken fan all these years and being a fan of, George Lynch and his guitar playing and stuff, talk about how that came about with your relationship with Don.
Well, prior to Neeley getting the hookup for me to meet Don, the first show I'd gone to, I tried to do some promotional stuff with my college radio, and I tried to get in touch with Dokken and their management. It was kind of more difficult to do because Dokken is not so much involved with their management. And years later, I realized that Don and all the other guys in Dokken are more likely to just stay after a show and meet people. But I was always the type of person, like, more introverted and shy. And I wasn't one likely to stay after a show and, like, try to meet a band. So through connections to the classic metal show, it was more of an intimate experience where not sexually, of course, but where I got to go backstage with Don, and specifically the first one was in Philadelphia. And not only did I get to meet Don, I got to meet Wendell. We'll use that name for now. And
another one.
Yeah, we got another one. And so from there, I just, got to meet Don more as and get to know him more as a person and a musician. And they say don't meet your heroes, but I'm glad I did. Some other instances where I met other people, I haven't felt the same way. But the most surprising thing about Don for me is his father figure. Him being a father was like, I could see that because I had tried to get my Dokken tattoo signed and he wouldn't do it. Almost like a father telling their kid, why would you do something that stupid? So I got to know Don personally more in that way. And, I hear Neeley say that, we have some correspondence through Neeley, and I've gotten to interview Don. And he's, of course, a great interview, and I could talk Dokken all day.
Yeah, hearing him on your show and hearing him on the Classic Metal show and just the chance I had to interview him, the guy's got stories for days and just hilarious guy. James, going back to what we were talking about Germany, how Don kind of got a start, which I thought was cool. It's something, I had discussed with him when we were doing the Inside Metal series is, again, you got to remember at that time in LA, this is when New Wave and Punk ruled the whole LA scene, under the whole US scene pretty much, as far as, radio and MTV and all that. It was all, the knack and, the new wave stuff going on. He took off to Germany, which I thought was very smart because, obviously Germany was happening. You had Scorpions, Accept, where it had just come out. And, of course, Michael Wagner was from there. I know Don had a relationship with not only Michael Wagner, but with Dieter Dierks, and he was involved I believe he did some vocals with Herman Rarebell, either on the Nip in the Bud or the Herman Z. German album. And he also did some background vocals on Scorpions' Blackout, when Klaus Meine was going through some throat issues. Did he elaborate on that in the book at all?
He did, yeah. He did. He helped the Scorpions when Klaus was having trouble with his vocal cords. And he told me a little bit about that. And I believe he said some of them got used, but most of them didn't. Most of his background stuff didn't get used. And it was just, it was used for backing track, or not backing tracks. I can't remember what he called it, but yeah, he was there. He was helping him out. And that's what kind of sparked the whole, the thing with Dieter Dierks. And because he did that, he got some free studio time. So he put together a demo with 5 or 6 songs. And that's basically what led to him getting his first record deal in like 1979.
And then after that, what brought him over to LA? I know he was dealing. I think he got a deal with, or he hooked up with Q Prime Management, Cliff Bernstein and Peter Mensch, prior to signing with Elektra. Correct?
He did, yeah. He those two guys found the Breaking the Chains album in an import bin, and they got in touch with Don, and they eventually re-released Breaking the Chains as Breaking the Chains with a G at the end. And then he wound up signing with Elektra Records and doing Tooth and Nail.
Right.
And that's what really shot Dokken, really brought them to become a household name was that album, They were having a lot of problems because the Breaking the Chains album didn't sell particularly well. But when they did Tooth and Nail, it just skyrocketed them, especially when they released... what was the big ballad?
Alone Again?
Alone Again, exactly.
Yeah.
That shot the album up to over a million sales, it made it go platinum.
Absolutely. And again, that was when MTV just really started turning into more of a hard rock metal video station. They were really playing a lot of the LA bands at the time. Of course, Motley Crue and Rat and all that were huge. And it's funny because when Dokken came, they already had the records out when they hit the LA scene. So they were they just kind of came right into the scene. I think that's why a lot of people didn't realize about Don Dokken's history. They just thought it was just some band that, boom, got a record out and it's already, playing the LA scene. So they weren't really as part of the LA scene as I remember in the early 80s with bands like Motley Crue were like the leaders. Steeler, believe it or not, were like, which was Ron Keel's old band, even prior to Yngwie, when he had the old Nashville guys with Dunnigan and all those guys. They were like one of the leading bands in LA, even ahead of Rat. It was always Motley Crue and Steeler, and then, of course, Rat and Warrior. Rat and Warrior both came up from San Diego. You had that San Diego clique with Warrior, Rat, Rough Cut, Jakey Lee, that whole kind of clan. And, of course, all those bands kind of came into their old fold. But at the time, all those bands kind of shared musicians, Rat, Dokken, Rough Cut, Jakey Lee, all these guys, until they kind of found their niche. And it's kind of funny how all these bands ended up getting signed pretty much around the same time. Rough Cut, Malice, Warrior, Armored Saint, Black and Blue, just boom, it really hit. So a lot of people thought, even though Dokken was a little bit previous to that, it just became this big LA metal explosion.
Mm-hmm. And Warren DeMartini actually played in Dokken for a time.
That's right. He talks about that. Yeah. When he was like 17, 18. Yeah.
Before jumping over to Rat. Yeah. Crazy.
So, Neeley, want to share any interesting Dokken stories here?
I do. One of the things, as a lot of people may or may not know, I'm sure a lot of the hardcores know this, but since James had an opportunity to interview Don extensively for this book, and Don is very, very forthcoming and, telling his stories and sharing his legacy. A lot of people don't realize that prior to Dokken getting signed or making it as a music act, Don was working his ass off behind the scenes. You threw out the name Black and Blue there. Of course, Jamie St. James and the boys, they got signed before Dokken did. And actually, Don was very instrumental in getting Black and Blue signed.
Wow. And they, of course, came over from Oregon. So they weren't even really an LA band.
And Don actually produced the first Great White releases.
Right.
So he and Jack Russell go back a long way. He and Jack are very, very tight to this day. And, he was very instrumental in getting Great White signed. He obviously produced XYZ. He produced Shy. He was very, very instrumental in other people's careers, not only the Dokken thing and being the front man and writing a lot of the lyrics or a good lion's share of the lyrics, but he worked with other bands and helped them be successful as well, and those are things that he never gets credit for. And the one thing, and I'm not gonna blow the Classic Metal Show horn too loud here, but one of the things that I believe the Classic Metal Show has done for Don personally is to personalize him with the fans, because prior to this, the only things that you ever read or ever heard of, especially with the rise of social media, Don's an asshole, he's a jerk, he's a this, he's that, And I've traveled with Don for 20 years now, and I've never seen that side of him. Never, not even once. And I often go, why do you have such a bad rap? And you know what it is because he's successful. He's a great musician. He's successful. He's smart. He's funny. He's well read. And I think a lot of people just are either intimidated by that, or they're jealous of it, or I'm not really sure. But the thing is Kendall's met Don. Obviously, James has interviewed him extensively. Don's been on the CMS many times. You, Bob, you've interviewed Don. I've never seen that side of what people say. He's a jerk. He's an asshole. He's self-centered. He's this. George Lynch is the man, and that's all you ever hear. But in reality, as much as I like George as a player, George is actually the troublemaker. He's the guy who's always stirring the shit. So, that's just my viewpoint after 25 years of being involved here. But great book by James. If you haven't picked it up and read it, James did a lot of in-depth interviews with Don, and obviously Jeff Pilson, as well as a lot of the peripheral people who have been involved with the Dokken legacy. And, if you have an interest in that kind of thing, I think you're really going to enjoy this book.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, the LA bands in general, the so-called quote-unquote hair metal bands of that era, get a lot of bad rap, and after interviewing a lot of these artists for the Inside Metal series, a lot of people say, this guy's an asshole, everyone was super cool, and, maybe years ago they were, but whatever, they were great people and spent a lot of time and very cordial. And Don particularly, we sat for 2 hours in his yard talking. So, and then we went up to his room and he was showing us all these old pictures and stuff. So yeah, a lot of these guys definitely get a bad rap, but I think it's just all has to do with the whole 80s metal kind of thing that they kind of clump everything together, as all these guys were just womanizing assholes, egomaniacs, blah, blah, blah. But you are correct there. James, I was wondering, some of the other people you interviewed in this, I know you interviewed Peter Baltus from Accept, who obviously played with Dokken on the Don Dokken album. Did you get a chance to interview John Norum or no?
No, I never did get in touch with him. There was a few guys I wanted to interview, but I couldn't get in touch with for one reason or another. I did interview Tom Werman, who did,
great, yeah,
work on Tooth and Nail, and he told me some great stories. But one thing I want to elaborate on, going back to the hair metal bands, quote unquote hair metal bands, is a lot of these guys don't get credit for being incredible musicians. They're looked at like almost like they're jokes. You take a band like Winger, and they were made fun of by Beavis and Butthead, but those guys are all accomplished musicians. Kip Winger is a compositional genius. I mean, come on, look at there's so many great guitar players out there that don't get any credit. And some of these guys are graduates with multiple master's degrees from accredited colleges. And a lot of these guys are in their 60s and 70s now, and they're teachers. They just don't get the credit for being great. Some of them great musicians.
Absolutely. And I think that is the sad thing about that whole 80s hair metal things. People just tie them into their image and their MTV videos, but they don't realize their virtuosity they had on their instruments, particularly a lot of the guitar players, but not only guitar players, the drummers, bassists, vocalists. You're absolutely right. I do remember that Don was very close with the Black and Blue guys when they first came over from Oregon. And it was pretty astonishing that Black and Blue, I believe, were one of the first bands after Motley Crue to get signed. in LA. As far as the LA bands, of course, you have Van Halen, but Black and Blue got signed prior to Quiet Riot and a lot of the other bands from what I understand. Was Don involved in getting Dieter Dierks to produce that debut Black and Blue record?
Well, he was actually. Dieter Dierks is the one who actually discovered Don.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, Don was singing at the Whiskey with his band Dokken, his incarnation Dokken, and Don tells the story how he was performing at the Whiskey, and Dieter Dierks happened to be in town in L.A. at the Whiskey, and he came up to Don and he introduced himself, and Don knew who he was, and he goes, "Oh, do you like my band?" He goes, "No, I don't like your band, but I like you." and that's when he invited him to come over to Germany to do the Scorpion sessions. He said he liked his vibrato, very similar to Klaus Meine, and that's how Don ended up going to Germany and being able to swap out his contributions to what could have been or would have been the Blackout album. In his compensation was using the studio over there to record some Dokken music.
Wow, I didn't realize he was that instrumental, Dieter Dierks, in getting Don over to Germany and that. Wow, interesting.
And Michael Wagner only came to the U.S. because Don brought him here.
Yeah, he was a kid back then. He was pretty young and very new.
So Don was very instrumental in what is or what was the 80s. I mean, he had his fingers in a lot of the pie back then, and a lot of people don't know it. Don was working his ass off as producer, promoter, musician. He was doing a lot of things at one time.
All right.
Wendell, when I interviewed Jack Russell, because Don basically discovered Great White. Jack Russell said basically without Don, maybe there's no Great White. He was that important.
That's another connection too. Great guy, and I've became pretty close with him, is Alan Niven, who obviously managed Great White and also managed Guns N' Roses. And I believe Alan Niven was incredibly instrumental in Guns N' Roses' success, because nobody could have got Guns N' Roses to get their shit together like Alan Niven did. And he was a part of that whole Total Access Redondo Beach scene as well. I know he and Don, it was like a family, and a lot of times, I've got to know Jack pretty well and interviewed him for several of the Inside Metal movies, as well as Band vs. Brand. As you know, Jack often refers to Don as like his father, and that he really took him on and helped him out, taught him a lot of stuff.
What's his nickname?
Calls him Pops.
Wait, he calls him Pops and Don calls him Son or something like that?
Yeah, pretty much.
Kendall, you've been kind of silent here. I'm sorry for not including you. Anything you want to add before we close this off?
Based on promotion of this book and to see how good it is, well, I very much enjoyed it. James, just out to you, because I knew of the timeline of Dokken and certain points in their history, but this book just went so in depth to why things happened and when they happened, and I really enjoyed the early incarnations of the band, because at first I had just seen YouTube videos of these early songs and pictures of the group members, and even in the comments of those YouTube videos with the song uploads, it's very controversial as to who is pictured, so it gets all these things solved for hardcore Dokken fans. But I have a question for Neeley. So based on the book, is there anything you read in this book that you hadn't known before about Dokken, considering your friendship with Don?
I think it's a lot of the really, really, really early stuff. The more popular stuff, I think, was well known for Dokken fans, but I like the way that James dug into the very early beginnings of the three-piece Dokken and the interviews that he did with Greg Leon and what's his name? Yeah, exactly. So those were some of the revelations, some of the very early stuff that I wasn't apprised of. So even I learned some good stuff out of that book.
Can you get into a little bit detail about, because I'm always been a huge fan of Greg Leon, and of course we involved him in the Inside Metal series, and he's another unknown guy that unfortunately never really got his big break, but with the Greg Leon invasion, were very instrumental on the LA scene, and of course Sweet 19, he had Tommy Lee in the band, and Joey Vera played with Greg Leon. Talk about some of the stuff Greg Leon and some of the other early musicians talked about.
Or you want me to answer that?
Yeah, like Gary Holland and some of the stories they've...
Yeah, Greg Leon, he's a great guitar player, and I've been interviewing Greg for my next book, which is going to be all about the great guitar players from the 80s. And yeah, he never really got his huge breaker, became a household name like an Eddie Van Halen or anybody like that, but he's another underrated guy, and if anybody gets a chance, they should go check out some of his work that he did. He was in a lot of different bands, like you were saying. He was an important and influential guy back in the day, and I think people should really spend a minute and go check that guy out, because he's a gifted musician and a gifted guitar player and a good vocalist.
Great vocalist, yeah.
One heck of a cool guy.
And for those that don't know, Greg also replaced Randy Rhoads in Quiet Riot, the original. But I believe at that time he had changed the name to Dubrow. But he was actually suggested, after Randy Rhoads got the Aussie gig, Randy suggested to Kevin Dubrow, hey, get this kid Greg Leon. And he played with Dubrow for several years before doing, not several years, but shortly before doing the Dokken stint.
Yeah, he did Dokken right after that. And then after Dokken, he just decided to go back on his own. He liked having a three-piece band, and he liked being the lead singer and the lead guitarist.
And Gary Holland, what's he got going on these days?
I know he plays in a couple of bands. I actually tried to interview him a couple times, but I never did get around to interview. But yeah, he does have a couple. I did speak to him a little bit, and he still plays, and he loves playing. I know that. I see him talking about it all the time, but I never did personally get to interview him.
Oh, okay, my bad. What about Steve Barry?
Stephen Barry, yeah, he's like an audio engineer or something like that now. So he's still mixed up in the music business and all of that. Super busy guy. It was hard to get him pinned down for an interview, but I finally did. He was just there for a short time, for like 2.5 years in the first incarnation of Dokken. So he didn't have a ton of stuff. His memory, he said, this is going back almost 45 years, Wow. But he gave me what he had, and which was interesting, about making the first 7-inch single that they made with Hard Luck Woman, I think it was on there. And where they recorded it, and talked a little bit about the Redondo Beach scene, because like you were saying, there was a scene in the whole Redondo Beach too, where Don was living and all of that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. And Martin Popoff, I see you got our good friend and Shockwave Skull Sessions regular Martin Popoff. You got some stories from him, or what was his involvement?
Yeah, I got some quotes from him, and he let me use bits and pieces of interviews he had done with Don and George and Jeff and stuff like that. He's always been very helpful with me.
All right, very cool. Well, I guess we could close this out. Was there anything else you guys wanted to add to this discussion?
Well, one of the things that was very instrumental, especially during that 80s era, was you mentioned, Bob, earlier in the discussion here about Total Access Studio. Total Access, kind of like... that studio was so responsible for so many releases in the 80s. Obviously, Dokken and Michael Wagner worked there, and Don owned that studio for a lot of years, and it's changed hands. I believe he sold it to Jack Russell at one point.
Wow.
And then he bought it back from Jack.
Oh, wow. Wasn't Win Davis one of the owners as well?
Yeah, Win Davis, I believe he owns it now, or I'm not even sure if it's still in existence. But it traded hands between Don and Jack and Win Davis. And
Alan Niven, I think, was involved with that.
I believe you're right.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that Tommy Chong actually recorded there in off hours. and if you see the movie called Far Out Man, right near the beginning of the movie, there's a scene there where Tommy Chong is eating breakfast, and what's that guy's name? Martin, can't remember that guy's name. He hosted America Tonight. I can't remember what his name. Martin Mull. He and Radon Chong went up to Tommy Chong and he's eating breakfast and he goes, "Hey, wait a minute, let me turn the music down." And there's Don and I believe it was John Norum. I don't know who was on drums, but they were all rocking out.
I heard about that. I got to check that out.
You can actually see the scene on YouTube. It's actually pretty funny. But also Don on Don's, I believe it was. I'm not sure if it was Mirror, or but Tommy Chong is on the beginning of the movie, or not. What I mean, the music video rather. And, he's claiming that the song he's listening to, he wrote that song. So Don has a friendship with Tommy Chong and would let him use Total Access Studio to record his comedy bits and all kinds of things, But Total Access Studio played a huge part in the 80s metal scene. A lot of bands recorded there. Obviously, Dokken recorded there. Wynn Davis engineered there, as well as Michael Wagner producing there. So a lot of bands recorded there. Great White. That studio is legendary, and I gotta say that I was very, very honored to be invited to go to Total Access Studio and be there and hang out there at one time. And it was just like, that was a great experience for me.
Absolutely, yeah. I remember vividly Total Access Studio and all the bands that went through there. And I believe another band Don was briefly involved was the great all-girl metal band Phantom Blue, and I think they recorded there as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Michelle Meldrum,
yes.
Who ended up marrying John
Norum.
John Norum, yeah.
James, why don't you give out the information on how people could get the new Dokken book?
Sure, they can get it on Amazon. It's available on Amazon or any other online retailers like Barnes & Nobles, or they can send me an email at curl88@hotmail.com. That's curl88 with 2 8s at hotmail.com, and I'll be more than happy to send out a copy to them. I have PayPal, but yeah, basically everybody's pretty much just been buying it off Amazon.
Right on. And that's James Curl. Curl is CURL. And are you doing the special autograph copies as well?
Yeah, I have copies that they'll be at my house tomorrow. So I will have autograph copies. If anybody wants my signature on a book for some reason, they can have it.
Very cool. And the full title, Dokken Into the Fire and Other Embers of 80s Metal History, correct?
Right.
All right.
Before we go, Bob, I just want to mention that James actually spent some real big coin for this cover. James?
That's right, a Mark Weiss cover, correct?
I did. That thing cost me, $1,000.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
And, of course, our own Chris Aiken, the co-host of the Classic Metal Show, he dressed that cover out.
He did.
Wow.
He designed the cover, and I love it.
And Don really did a big favor for James. Why don't you tell him, James?
He did. I was a little nervous, and I didn't want to do it, but I texted Don and asked him if I could use the Dokken logo for the book, and he said, absolutely. He said, that's what everybody recognizes. You have my permission. If anybody says anything, they can talk to me. I said, all right, thank you. I'm just very, very appreciative that he did that.
Bigger Mark Weiss, he has a new photo book that just came out too, I believe.
I bought it yesterday, Bob. I bought it off of Amazon yesterday, $45.
Wow. Well, at least it wasn't $1,045.
Yeah, it was the decade of decadence. I had to buy it.
All right, odd man. Yeah, he was old school photographer. Of course, did a lot of the Guns N' Roses, tons of the bands back in those days. Yeah, and Kendall, let people know about your radio show and how they could tune into it.
Sure thing. It's Metal and Kendle on uncontrollednoise.com, and it's Wednesdays, 9 p.m. Eastern till 11, so 2 hours live, and I take everyone's requests.
Everyone's requests?
And she's live at the Classic Metal Show chat room, chatandkill.com, right, Kendall?
Of course.
That's right. Of course, the Classic Metal Show heard every Saturday night from 6 p.m. to 2 till midnight. Pacific Standard Time. Is that correct, Neeley?
Yeah, it would be 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, 6-hour show, all live, nothing but off-the-cuff riffing, nothing's planned. You know, Bob, you've been on the show many times.
I do know. We'll see how long that show lasts. I hear your partner, Chris Aiken, is doing another podcast with my partner, Matt Hartnett. I hear they're building this big conspiracy against us, Neeley. What do you think about that?
That's okay, Bob, because if something happens to Chris, the next incarnation of the show will be Wendell and Kendall.
No, there you go. No, actually, I love Aftershocks. I think that's good for both Matt and Chris. I know Chris wants to get his inner metal feelings out there. He's with stuff he can't do on the classic metal show, I suppose.
Yeah, he likes to dabble in all kinds of, avenues outside of a classic metal thing. But anyway, the classic metal show has more become commentary and a talk show more than metal than anything. But it has the whole attitude of in your face, fuck you, I'll give you a punch just like Don Dokken. We'll do you other.
That's right, the mother trucker. Well, very, very cool. Ladies and gentlemen, glad to have you guys all on board. Definitely check out the new Dokken Book, Into the Fire and Other Embers of 80s Metal History. Order it on Amazon by James Curl. And, of course, check out the Classic Metal Show every Saturday night. And, Kendall, your show follows that?
Wednesday nights.
Wednesday
so
nights,
some
okay.
midweek metal.
Kendall, Neeley, and James, it was a pleasure having you guys on.
Hey, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.